think about the giants who run our world, the CEOs of tech empires, the policymakers shaping your future, the institutional leaders holding the keys to global power. You think you know them. You think they are just baby boomers. But you are wrong. Deep within the fabric of modern history, there is a ghost. A generation as massive as it is influential, yet history has almost never spoken its name. If you were born between 1954 and 1965, you know exactly what I'm talking about. That strange, persistent feeling of being present at every major transition of the modern era, and yet, somehow, being folded into someone else's story. You aren't on the margins. You are the operational core of the 21st century. But culturally, you remain invisible. For decades, you were misclassified, grouped into the massive boomer category, causing your distinct psychological journey to blur and fade. Your formative years were different. Your entry into the economy was different. Your entire relationship with risk and success was forged in a fire no one else had to face. This is not just another demographic group. This is a cohort defined by a unique kind of resilience and a silent internal struggle for identity. Today, we finally pull back the curtain. We stop the erasure. Welcome to the untold psychology of the in-between generation. We call them Generation Jones. To understand why this generation feels so displaced today, we have to look back at the world that raised them. Imagine growing up inside a giant cultural promise. In the late 1950s and early 60s, the air felt thick with a specific kind of certainty. As children, Generation Jones watched the same television shows and heard the same guidance as their older boomer siblings. The message was everywhere, from suburban kitchen tables to school assembly halls. Work hard, stay responsible, play by the rules, and a stable, prosperous life would follow as naturally as adulthood itself. For them, the future wasn't a mystery to be solved. It was a destination already prepared. They absorbed a social script that was crystal clear. They saw upward mobility not as an exception, but as the norm. Their psychological foundation was built on anticipated continuity, the deep-seated assumption that the world would simply keep expanding to include them when their turn arrived. They weren't raised to be warriors or rebels. They were raised to be the heirs of the post-war American dream. They spent their childhoods meticulously preparing for a game where the rules were fair and the prize was guaranteed. But what happens when you spend years training for a race, only to find that when you reach the starting line, the track has been demolished? The tragedy of Generation Jones isn't just that they encountered hardship, it's the timing of that hardship. Just as they reached the threshold of independence, that critical moment in your late teens and early 20s when your identity and life direction begin to solidify, the world they were promised simply vanished. The expansion that had defined their childhood suddenly stalled. The cultural atmosphere shifted, almost overnight, from confidence to deep uncertainty. Political trust fractured. Economic stability weakened. And the clean, predictable trajectory they had internalized as children no longer matched the reality they were forced to inhabit. Psychologists call this expectation violation. But for Generation Jones, it wasn't just a disappointment. It was a structural rupture of the soul. Think of it this way. You were handed a detailed map at birth. You spent 20 years studying every road, every turn, and every destination on that map. But the moment you stepped out the door to begin your journey, you realized the terrain had shifted. The roads were gone. The bridges were broken. The map in your hand was perfect, but the world beneath your feet was unrecognizable. They entered adulthood carrying a clear internal contract. Stability would follow effort. Security would follow responsibility. They had rehearsed this belief in every school lesson and every piece of parental advice. But the reality? Entry-level pathways narrowed. Housing costs drifted far beyond reach. Long-term employment guarantees began to crumble. Even those who did everything correctly, those who followed every rule, encountered a volatile world that refused to reciprocate. This created a lasting cognitive dissonance, a sense that a promise had been quietly withdrawn, without anyone ever admitting it had been made in the first place. For Generation Jones, the ground didn't just shake, it shifted permanently, right as their adult lives began. When the ground shifts beneath your feet just as you're trying to stand, you learn a hard lesson. Stability is not a birthright. It is something you must build, brick by brick, and then defend with everything you have. This realization gave birth to a unique psychological orientation: practical cynicism. Unlike the older boomers, who often moved through the world with a sense of broad optimism, and unlike Gen X, who arrived later to find the institutions already broken, Generation Jones stands caught between the two. They didn't abandon the dream of stability. They had already internalized it too deeply. But they learned, through bitter early experience, that the system would not meet them halfway. For them, work became more than just a paycheck. It became a fortress. They pursued titles, professional credibility, and institutional roles with a quiet, sustained intensity. But look closer at that ambition. It isn't flamboyant or driven by a thirst for fame. It is driven by the need for insulation. In their minds, every promotion, every certification, and every year of loyalty to an organization is a layer of armor. Success is the only proof that they haven't slipped into the precarity they witnessed in their youth. This is why they are often the most diligent people in the room. Their reliability and endurance through corporate restructuring aren't just about a strong work ethic. They are psychological stabilizers. Underneath the suit and the steady performance lies a subtle, persistent vigilance. They remember when the world withdrew its promise, and they have spent their entire careers making sure they are too indispensable to be cast aside again. For Generation Jones, accomplishment was never just about getting ahead. It was about making sure they never, ever fell back. Generation Jones occupies a narrow yet exhausting position in history. They are the last cohort to spend their childhood in a fully analog world, and the first required to spend their prime working years building the digital one. They remember the tactile weight of rotary phones, the rhythmic clack of typewriters, and the permanence of paper systems. But they didn't just witness the digital revolution. They operationalized it. They became the translators, explaining legacy structures to younger colleagues and new tools to their older boomer bosses. This is the origin of what we call bridge fatigue. To those above them, they often seem too ready to revise tradition. To those below, they appear as extensions of the old guard. They move fluently between both worlds, yet they seldom feel a true sense of belonging in either. They are the link that holds the chain together, but the link itself is rarely the center of attention. This role of the silent stabilizer carries over into their most intimate lives. For Generation Jones, intimacy was recalibrated by the volatility of the 70s and 80s. They inherited a mid-century model of love, one defined by endurance and provision. But they built their families during a time when stability could no longer be assumed. As a result, they translated love into responsibility. They might not be the generation of verbal vulnerability or expressive romance. Instead, their emotional signals are found in mortgages paid, careers sustained through layoffs, and household structures kept intact despite external storms. Emotional restraint wasn't indifference, it was containment. They carried their burdens privately so their families wouldn't have to. For this generation, reliability replaced reassurance. Acts replaced declarations. They loved through structure, believing that the greatest gift they could give was a world that remained steady, even when their own hearts were tired. As Generation Jones moves into the twilight of their careers, a quiet, unsettling question begins to surface. Was it enough? Not just the bank accounts or the professional titles, but the narrative. Did all that endurance finally resolve into the stable life they were promised as children? Or did they simply spend an entire lifetime stabilizing a world that never truly settled? For a cohort that fused their very identity with their contribution to society, retirement is more than an economic transition. It is a profound identity crisis. When the roles loosen and the office doors close, many find themselves facing an unfamiliar void, a selfhood without a constant function. After decades of using achievement as a shield, standing without that armor can feel like a dangerous exposure. But there is a different way to read this story. Generation Jones did not fail to inherit stability. They performed a much greater feat. They carried the flame of continuity across a massive historical rupture. They absorbed the systemic shocks of 2 centuries, the death of the analog world and the birth of the digital age, and they still built the institutions, families, and frameworks that the rest of us now inhabit so easily. Their story is not unfinished because it lacked success. It is unfinished because it has rarely been fully named. So to the generation born between the lines, those who held the center when the ground shifted, we see you. Your legacy isn't just what you built. It's the fact that you never let go of the bridge while we were all crossing it. It is time we finally call you by your name.